Picture this. A brilliant young black attorney, daughter of one of the city's most respected Supreme Court judges, walks into Atlanta's most exclusive dining establishment to celebrate her first major courtroom win. What happened next would spark a movement that shook the entire city to its core. The police officers who humiliated her had no idea who they were dealing with, and the consequences that followed would make headlines nationwide. The Ashford restaurant represented everything money could buy in Atlanta's dining scene. Sparkling, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished marble floors, while pristine white tablecloths adorned every perfectly positioned table. This wasn't just dinner. This was a statement, a declaration that you had arrived. Into this world of privilege stepped Talia Monroe, 25 years old, moving with the quiet confidence that comes from years of fighting for respect in rooms that didn't expect her. Her rich, dark skin created a striking contrast against the soft pink dress she'd chosen for this special evening. After securing her first major legal victory as a junior attorney, she deserved this moment of celebration. Just a peaceful meal to mark her achievement, but the atmosphere shifted the instant she crossed the threshold. Conversations suddenly hushed. Silverware froze halfway to mouths. Every eye in the room seemed to track her movement, filled with curiosity, doubt, and unmistakable hostility. Behind the host podium stood Trevor, his hair perfectly styled, wearing that practiced smile that expensive establishments train into their staff. But when his gaze landed on Talia, something icy flickered behind his polished exterior. "Good evening," Talia said with calm professionalism. "I have a reservation under Monroe for 7 Puan. Trevor's expression soured instantly. "Are you certain you're in the correct establishment, miss?" The condescension dripped from every word. Talia's smile grew tighter, but she maintained her composure. She displayed her phone screen showing the confirmed reservation from 2 days prior. Trevor made a show of checking his system, his movements deliberately slow and dismissive. "I apologize," he finally announced without a trace of sincerity, "but we're completely booked this evening. Perhaps you'd find somewhere less sophisticated, more suitable." That word "less" hung in the air like a verbal assault. Talia straightened her shoulders. She recognized this game. She'd encountered it in law school, in courtrooms, on sidewalks where her very presence seemed to threaten some invisible order. "I have a confirmed reservation," she stated firmly. A woman dripping in pearls and designer clothing observed from nearby, her expression showing the mild entertainment of someone expecting a spectacle. Trevor's eyes swept over Talia dismissively before signaling to Tom, the intimidating security guard stationed near the entrance. "Tom, could you provide some assistance here?" Trevor called out. The security officer approached with aggressive body language, arms folded across his broad chest. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" "No issue at all," Talia responded steadily. "Simply requesting to be seated for my reservation?" Trevor let out a condescending chuckle. "This patron appears to be experiencing some confusion." The familiar cocktail of rage and humiliation coursed through Talia's veins. Words like confused, troublemaker, and doesn't belong. She'd heard them all before, never spoken directly but sharp enough to wound. Before she could formulate a response, 2 police officers who had been enjoying coffee at the bar took notice of the commotion. Officers Brad Keene and David Morris approached with the leisurely confidence of men who knew the system typically worked in their favor. "What's the situation here?" Officer Keene inquired, his hand casually positioned on his equipment belt. Trevor straightened immediately. "She's refusing to depart after being informed no tables are available." "Is that right?" Officer Morris asked, examining Talia like she was some kind of unwelcome intruder in sacred space. "I'm not refusing anything," Talia replied, keeping her voice controlled despite the tension building inside her. "I made a reservation. I have documentation." Officer Keene smirked dismissively. "I'm certain you believe you do." Without warning, he reached out and grasped her arm, not violently, but with enough force to send a clear message. Talia gasped and instinctively pulled away. "I haven't violated any laws." "You're creating a public disturbance," Officer Morris declared, raising his voice to ensure the entire restaurant could hear. "We need you to exit the premises." The dining room had become a theater, with every patron now openly staring. Not one person moved to intervene. "You're targeting me because of my race," Talia said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Officer Keen's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "I'd be careful about making accusations you can't substantiate." He produced a pair of handcuffs. The ultimate humiliation. Talia felt time slow to a crawl. This nightmare couldn't be real. Not here. Not after everything she'd worked to accomplish. "You're making a serious error," she whispered, barely audible. "Of course we are," Keen replied mockingly, preparing to open the restraints. Before he could make contact again, the restaurant's entrance doors burst open with explosive force. Judge Nathaniel Monroe, Talia's father, entered like a force of nature. His imposing frame, tall, powerful, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit and gray overcoat, commanded immediate attention. His eyes, identical to Talia's in their deep brown intensity, swept the room with laser precision, taking in the officers, the security guard, and his daughter frozen in this impossible scene. "Remove your hands from my daughter," he commanded, his voice a thunderous boom that silenced every conversation in the restaurant. Officer Keen froze mid-motion. Officer Morris stepped backward uncertainly. Trevor's face drained of all color. "Judge," Monroe moved forward deliberately, each step radiating the authority built over decades of courtroom experience. "Perhaps one of you gentlemen," he said, his tone deadly calm, "would care to explain exactly why you're attempting to detain an innocent woman whose only crime was entering an establishment she had every legal right to access?" The silence was absolutely deafening. Talia exhaled shakily, feeling her father's commanding presence anchor her spinning world. "You will release her immediately," Judge Monroe stated, "and you will offer a public apology, or I guarantee the consequences of this incident will reverberate throughout every corner of this city and far beyond." Judge Monroe's words carried the weight of absolute authority, and for several heartbeats, nobody dared move. Officer Keen slowly lowered the handcuffs, his jaw clenched in a tight line, while Officer Morris shuffled uncomfortably, clearing his throat but finding himself speechless. Trevor appeared rooted in place, his hands visibly shaking as he attempted to straighten his jacket. Several diners, emboldened by this dramatic reversal, began speaking in louder whispers, some pulling out smartphones to document this unforgettable confrontation. Talia, still feeling the phantom sensation of the officer's grip on her arm, fought back tears and moved closer to her father, overwhelmed with gratitude for his powerful intervention. Judge Monroe remained unwavering. His voice stayed measured, deliberate, slicing through the uncomfortable quiet. "Apologize to my daughter immediately," Trevor swallowed hard, stepping forward with the strained, mechanical politeness of someone watching their career flash before their eyes. "Miss Monroe, on behalf of the Ashford establishment, I offer my deepest apologies for this misunderstanding," he mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. Officer Keen muttered something barely comprehensible that might have resembled an apology, but sounded more like a growl of resentment. The damage, however, was already complete, and everyone present understood that fact. Judge Monroe turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the dining guests, whose expressions ranged from guilty fascination to outright shame. "This," he declared, his voice quiet but fierce, "demonstrates exactly what prejudice looks like. This shows how dignity gets destroyed, not through violence, but through calculated, systematic humiliation." His stare pinned each officer in place. "You made judgments about my daughter based solely on her skin color, not her behavior, not any perceived threat, simply because she had the audacity to enter a space you decided she didn't deserve." No one could look away from his powerful words. Without another syllable, Judge Monroe placed his protective hand on Talia's back and guided her toward the exit. They didn't hurry. They didn't slink away in defeat. They walked with dignity, intact. A father and daughter refusing to bow before ignorance. As they stepped onto the cool evening sidewalk, camera flashes illuminated their path. Somehow news of the incident had already leaked, and local journalists were hungry for the story. Microphones pushed forward aggressively, questions flying from all directions. "Judge Monroe, can you provide a statement about tonight's events? Miss Monroe, were you physically assaulted? Will there be legal action taken?" Talia hesitated, the chaotic energy buzzing around her like an overwhelming swarm, but her father's gentle touch on her arm and encouraging nod gave her strength. She understood his message. Facing the cameras directly, Talia spoke with clear conviction. "This evening I was treated like a criminal for the simple act of existing in a space that didn't anticipate someone like me. But I refused to remain silent. I refused to accept shame. I committed no wrongdoing, and no human being should have to justify their right to basic dignity and respect." Her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable strength that even the clicking cameras couldn't diminish. Judge Monroe added, "This incident is not isolated. It represents part of a larger, more profound sickness that our society must confront, and we absolutely will." By dawn, the story had exploded across every platform. Local television stations broadcast footage of the confrontation, and the clips spread like wildfire across social media networks. Hashtags demanding justice for Talia Monroe began trending nationally within hours. Television talk shows dissected the story. Radio personalities engaged in heated debates. The Ashfords' email inbox was flooded with messages, some furious, others defensive, many demanding immediate accountability. The restaurant released a generic public apology, but it barely slowed the growing tide of outrage. Within days, Atlanta's mayor personally contacted Judge Monroe, expressing regret and promising a thorough internal investigation. The police department launched an inquiry into Officers Keene and Morris, placing both on administrative leave pending disciplinary proceedings. Meanwhile, Talia found herself thrust into an unexpected role she hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. Invitations poured in requesting her to speak at community gatherings, university campuses, even rallies organized by civil rights organizations. Initially, the sudden attention felt overwhelming. She had never wanted fame. All she'd desired was to celebrate a personal achievement with a quiet meal. But gradually, as days became weeks, she recognized something more significant was emerging. This transcended her individual experience. It represented every young black person who had been made to feel diminished in spaces that should have welcomed them. Every suspicious glance, every whispered insult, every denied opportunity had culminated in this moment. With her father's unwavering support, Talia decided to take action. She filed an official civil rights complaint against both the Ashford restaurant and the Atlanta Police Department. Her legal team, assembled from allies throughout the city, included some of the South's most respected civil rights attorneys. They constructed a case addressing not just one ruined evening, but systematic discrimination, a pattern of behavior that could no longer be tolerated. Talia also began organizing speaking engagements under her Right to Dignity banner, a movement she hoped would generate meaningful conversations about racism in public spaces, not just in courtrooms or academic settings, but in the quiet corners of daily life where bias lived and flourished. At one of her inaugural rallies, standing before an ocean of faces spanning all ages and backgrounds, Talia shared her story again. This time, however, her voice resonated with newfound strength. "When they attempted to diminish me," she declared, "they underestimated my resolve. They underestimated all of us because we are not small, we are not invisible, we are not disappearing." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Talia felt something inside her solidify. She would not be defined by their hatred. She would define herself through pride, power, and the unbreakable dignity inherited from generations who had stood before her. Meanwhile, pressure intensified on the Ashfords' ownership. Multiple corporate sponsors canceled future event bookings. High-profile celebrities announced public boycotts. Reviews flooded platforms like Yelp and TripAdvisor, each more devastating than the last. This had evolved beyond a single bad experience. It had become a symbol, a lightning rod in a city still wrestling with deep racial divisions. Officer Keene issued a half-hearted apology through his legal representative, claiming stress and confusion had influenced his actions. Few people found his explanation credible. Officer Morris more quietly submitted his resignation, stating he no longer felt comfortable serving in a department that tolerated such behavior. Throughout all of this, Talia remained focused not on revenge, but on creating genuine change. She met privately with the police chief, advocating for improved training and policies emphasizing de-escalation and implicit bias education. She participated in panels with business leaders, challenging them to create authentically inclusive environments, not just inclusive marketing campaigns. At every opportunity, she repeated her core message: respect is not a privilege, it is a fundamental right. Late one evening, weeks after the incident, Talia and her father sat together in his living room, the soft fireplace glow creating warmth between them. Judge Monroe sipped his coffee thoughtfully before speaking. "You know," he said, "when I entered that restaurant that night, I remembered all the times I had been the invisible man in similar rooms. Watching you stand your ground made me realize something important. You possess strength I never had at your age." Talia smiled, a small, weary smile, but genuine nonetheless. "I had an excellent teacher," she replied. He reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "The world isn't going to transform overnight. But you've cracked something open, Talia. You've given people permission to see what they work so hard to ignore." Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, alive with both its flaws and its possibilities. Inside that peaceful room, a young woman who had once been told she didn't belong anywhere realized she had created something greater than herself, a movement demanding simply and powerfully the right to belong everywhere. The courtroom vibrated with tense electric energy as the trial commenced. Journalists packed the rear sections, pens ready, cameras prepared to capture every expression and misstep. On one side sat the legal team representing the Ashford and the involved officers. On the opposite side sat Talia Monroe, surrounded by her attorneys and her father, Judge Nathaniel Monroe, who, while not speaking on her behalf in court, attended every session as a silent pillar of support. The presiding judge, a stern woman named Eleanor Whitmore, wasted no time with unnecessary formalities. She grasped the significance of this case. It wasn't merely about one young woman's disrupted evening, it concerned the kind of city Atlanta aspired to become, whether discrimination could still be dismissed as misunderstanding or if it would finally be confronted for what it truly was. Talia sat with perfect posture as her lead attorney, Marcus Holloway, presented opening arguments with calm precision. He painted a comprehensive picture not just of Talia's experience, but of a systematic culture that had enabled it to occur. A culture where unchecked bias had infiltrated every aspect of public life, including elite restaurants and the police, force sworn to serve and protect all citizens equally. The defense team attempted to argue that everything was simply an unfortunate mistake, that the officers had acted from legitimate public safety concerns, that the restaurant staff had merely followed standard protocol. But their arguments sounded empty. Their justifications stretched beyond credibility. Footage from diners' phones played on courtroom monitors, showing Talia standing peacefully while officers advanced with handcuffs ready and the manager smirking. Nearby, no shouting occurred, no threats were made, no justification existed. Talia testified on the third day. The courtroom held its collective breath as she recounted that evening, her voice steady but woven with emotion. She spoke not only of that specific night, but of countless small indignities accumulated over a lifetime. Stores where she was followed, interviews where she was underestimated, sidewalks where strangers clutched their belongings tighter. She spoke for every black girl who had been made to feel lesser in places they had every right to occupy. When she concluded, the courtroom sat in profound silence, the gravity of her testimony settling like a heavy stone. Even defense attorneys looked downward, scribbling meaningless notes they would never reference. In subsequent days, Witnesses testified. Ashford patrons described what they had observed: a composed young woman treated like a criminal without justification. Experts on racial bias explained the insidious ways discrimination manifested in everyday interactions. Former Ashford employees, empowered by the spotlight, came forward to describe a culture that subtly but consistently treated black patrons and staff differently. Stories emerged of mysteriously lost reservations, of tables that suddenly became unavailable, of black servers relegated to back areas where they would be less visible. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Throughout it all, Talia maintained her composure, but internally a tempest raged. There were moments she wanted to scream, moments she wanted to weep, moments she questioned whether standing up had been worth the price. But every time she glanced over and saw her father's steady gaze, she remembered why she had begun this journey. Not for revenge, but for dignity, for change, for the generations following behind her. As the trial approached its conclusion, the defense grew increasingly desperate, launching thinly veiled attacks on Talia's character, suggesting she had sought attention, that she had provoked the situation. But the jury, diverse, thoughtful, and deeply aware of the stakes, saw through these tactics. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. Marcus Holloway spoke of accountability, of the opportunity to send a message that Atlanta would not be a city that ignored injustice. He asked the jury to consider not just Talia's experience, but the ripple effects of allowing such behavior to continue unchecked. The defense, in contrast, relied heavily on appeals for understanding and forgiveness for the officers and restaurant, portraying them as victims of excessive activism. It was a weak, desperate strategy that fell completely flat. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. When they returned, the courtroom tension was palpable. Talia gripped the table edge, feeling her father's reassuring hand on her shoulder. The foreman, a middle-aged black woman with compassionate eyes, stood and read the verdict in favor of Talia Monroe. Damages awarded not only for emotional distress, but also punitive damages against both the Ashford and the Atlanta Police Department. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Tears filled Talia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not yet. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed the court, and immediately reporters surged forward. But Talia didn't rush to the microphones. She stood slowly, turned to her father, and allowed herself a small, private smile. They had won, not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced, shamed, or turned away. At the press conference that followed, Talia spoke with clarity and power. "This victory doesn't belong to me alone," she said. "It belongs to every person who has ever been made to feel they didn't belong simply because of their appearance. It belongs to those who came before me and those who will come after. This isn't the conclusion. This is the beginning." In the months that followed, tangible transformations unfolded. The Ashford announced a complete overhaul of its management and staff training programs. While rebuilding public trust proved more challenging, the Atlanta Police Department implemented mandatory anti-bias training, and several officers inspired by the case began advocating for broader reforms from within. Talia continued her work with the Right to Dignity initiative, traveling to schools, churches, and community centers, speaking not just about her experience, but about the deeper, more profound roots of racism and the quiet courage required to confront it. One evening, standing on stage at a packed auditorium at Spelman College, Talia looked out at the faces, young, eager, burning with the same fire she had once barely dared to display, and felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. "We are not guests in our own nation," she declared, her voice resonating throughout the space. "We are not visitors in spaces our ancestors helped construct. We are not trespassers in restaurants, boardrooms, schools, or dreams. We belong, and we will never again request permission to exist." The applause thundered around her, not polite or perfunctory, but roaring with the force of generations finally demanding to be heard. Back home that night, Talia sat by her window, gazing out over the city lights. Her phone buzzed constantly with congratulations from friends, strangers, people she had never met who told her repeatedly that her story had given them courage. Judge Monroe entered the room quietly, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea, and handed her one. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, warriors in the same enduring battle. Finally, Judge Monroe spoke, his voice gentle. "You changed something fundamental, Talia." She looked at him, her heart full. "We changed something," she corrected. And beyond the window, the city breathed, restless and alive, a little more awakened, a little more just, because one young woman had refused to remain silent.